Hey everyone, and a mythical midnight to you. Picture two Roman teenagers on the same day, but their worlds couldn't be more different. Marcus, 16, is about to strip off his childhood Bulla and put on his first adult Toga, a moment that will make him a citizen with real power. Roman boys typically made this transition between ages 14 and 17, often during the Liberalia festival on March 17th. Meanwhile, 14-year-old Livia is preparing for her wedding to a man twice her age, knowing this ceremony will define her entire future. Tonight, we're exploring how Roman boys and girls took completely opposite paths to adulthood, and why mythology was their survival guide through it all. If you find these kinds of hidden histories as fascinating as I do, be sure to subscribe and click the like button to join our community of myth explorers. For Marcus, tomorrow means saying goodbye to the protective charm he's worn his entire life. This small golden locket has been his constant companion, and the weight of what comes next feels heavier than the charm itself. Marcus rolls the Bulla between his fingers one more time. The metal feels warm from his skin, familiar after 16 years of constant wear. This protective amulet has hung around his neck since he was 9 days old, when his father first placed it there during his naming ceremony. Tomorrow morning, he'll remove it forever and place it on the family altar as an offering to the household gods. The thought makes his stomach twist. You have to understand, the Bulla wasn't some cute piece of jewelry Roman parents gave their kids. This thing was serious protective magic. Romans believed evil spirits constantly hunted children, drawn to their innocence and vulnerability. The Bulla acted like a spiritual shield, keeping malevolent forces at bay through a combination of sacred symbols and hidden charms tucked inside its hollow center. Without it, Marcus would be walking around spiritually naked in a world full of supernatural dangers. Let's be honest, what parents put inside these Bullas was pretty wild stuff. Marcus's Bulla contains a tiny piece of red coral, which Romans thought could ward off the evil eye and prevent nightmares. There's also a miniature bronze phallus, because Romans believed nothing scared away demons quite like male fertility symbols. His mother even slipped in a small scroll with protective spells written in her own handwriting, invoking Hercules and Mars to keep her son safe from harm. Rich families like Marcus's could afford gold Bullas with intricate engravings of protective gods, while poorer children made do with leather pouches containing similar amulets. But here's the thing that would surprise you. Romans genuinely believed the spiritual protection worked exactly the same, regardless of the material. The fear of losing this protection was real and intense. Many boys felt genuine dread about giving up their Bullas, as ancient accounts tell us of stolen charms and constant fear of malevolent spirits. These weren't weak kids either. These were the same boys who'd soon be expected to march into battle and face down Germanic warriors. Marcus knows he can't back out even if he wanted to. Tomorrow's ceremony will include his grandfather, uncles, male cousins, and family friends. Basically every important man in his social circle. They'll all watch as he removes the Bulla with his own hands and places it on the altar. No father would let his son skip this ritual, because keeping your childhood protections meant you weren't ready for adult responsibilities. The social pressure was massive and completely unavoidable. Now here's where things get really interesting. While Marcus prepares to lose his magical protection forever, his sister Livia gets to keep all her childhood charms for her entire life. Roman girls never had a Bulla removal ceremony. They wore their protective amulets from childhood through marriage and into old age. Livia's collection includes a small silver hand to ward off jealousy, a piece of amber for good health, and a tiny owl for wisdom. She'll wear these same charms at her wedding during childbirth, and even as an elderly matron managing her household. You might think this sounds unfair, but Romans saw it differently. Men were supposed to be strong enough to face the world without magical help once they reached adulthood. Real Roman citizens didn't need charms and amulets. They had courage, skill, and the favor of the state gods. Women, on the other hand, were considered naturally more vulnerable to supernatural threats because of their connection to childbirth, domestic spaces, and emotional matters. They needed constant protection that men could supposedly do without. The psychological impact of this difference was huge. Marcus faces tomorrow knowing he'll lose the one thing that's kept him safe his entire life. Every nightmare that didn't come, every illness he avoided, every accident that missed him. He's attributed all of it to his Bulla's power. Now he has to trust that he's strong enough to survive without it. Meanwhile, Livia can rely on her protective charms forever, but she's also being told she'll never be strong enough to face the world without magical help. Some Roman fathers delayed their sons' Bulla ceremonies if they thought the boy wasn't emotionally ready for this spiritual independence. Imagine your dad looking at you and deciding you were still too scared and immature to give up your magical protection. That kind of judgment could delay your entry into adult society by months or even years, affecting everything from marriage prospects to career opportunities. The pressure to seem brave and ready was intense. Marcus's Bulla also represents his last connection to childhood innocence. Once he removes it, he'll be legally and spiritually considered a man, with all the expectations that brings. He'll need to start thinking about military service, marriage, and carrying on the family name. The carefree days of playing with toy soldiers and listening to his tutor's stories will be officially over. The Bulla ceremony marks the exact moment when Roman society stops seeing you as a protected child and starts seeing you as a potential soldier, citizen, and head of household. The timing of this ceremony wasn't random either. Most Roman boys gave up their bullas around age 16, right before they put on their first adult toga. This created a brief but terrifying window where they were no longer children, but not yet fully adult citizens. They'd lost their magical protection, but hadn't gained their legal rights. It was like being caught between two worlds, vulnerable in ways they'd never experienced before. What made this even more intense was that the ceremony usually happened at dawn, so Marcus would wake up with his Bulla and go to bed without it on the same day. There was no gradual transition or practice period. One moment you're magically protected, the next you're facing the world with nothing but your own courage. Romans believed this sudden change built character and forced boys to grow up quickly. Marcus touches his Bulla one final time as the sun sets on his last day of childhood. Tomorrow he'll discover what it feels like to walk through Rome without the protective charm that's guarded him since birth. The weight of adult expectations is already settling on his shoulders, and soon he'll face the most important garment of his entire life. March 17th arrives with the kind of crisp dawn that makes everything feel important. Marcus stands in his family's atrium, staring at 18 feet of pure white wool draped over a wooden frame. This isn't just any piece of clothing waiting for him. This is his toga virilis, the garment that will legally transform him from a child into a Roman citizen in the space of a single morning. His hands shake slightly as he reaches out to touch the fabric. The wool feels heavier than he expected, almost like it knows the weight of responsibility it carries. The truth is, putting on a toga correctly was basically an art form that separated real Romans from everyone else trying to fake it. You couldn't just throw this thing over your shoulders and call it a day. The toga required specific draping techniques that had been passed down through generations of Roman men. Get the folds wrong, and everyone who saw you would know you didn't deserve to wear it. The garment had to fall in precise pleats across your left shoulder, wrap around your torso in a specific pattern, and drape over your left arm at exactly the right length. Miss any of these details, and you'd look like a barbarian playing dress-up. Marcus's father watches from across the room, studying his son's face for any sign of fear or hesitation. This moment isn't just about Marcus putting on new clothes. His father has the final say on whether his son is truly ready for this transformation. Roman boys typically assumed the toga virilis between ages 14 and 17, but the timing depended entirely on their father's judgment. Cicero received his toga at 16, as did his son Marcus later. Augustus was just 15 when he became a citizen, while Marcus Aurelius waited until 16. Some Roman boys waited even longer if their fathers decided they seemed too immature or emotionally unprepared for adult responsibilities. Imagine having your own dad look at you and decide you weren't brave enough or smart enough to become a citizen yet. The shame would follow you for years, affecting your marriage prospects and career opportunities. The ceremony begins before most of Rome is even awake. Marcus's extended family gathers in the atrium as his father helps him into the toga for the first time. The white wool is heavier than his childhood tunic, and the complex draping makes him feel like he's wearing a costume. But the moment the final fold settles into place, something changes in how everyone looks at him. His grandfather nods approvingly. His uncles smile with genuine pride. Even his mother, watching from the women's section of the house, has tears in her eyes. Marcus is no longer her little boy. He's officially a man. Now comes the part that would make modern teenagers absolutely panic. Marcus has to walk through Rome's busy streets in his brand new toga, and everyone he passes will know exactly what's happening. The toga virilis has a distinctive look that screams, "New citizen having his first day as an adult." Strangers stop him to offer congratulations. Shopkeepers call out good wishes from their stalls. Older men give him knowing looks and remember their own toga ceremonies decades earlier. The attention is both thrilling and terrifying. Every step feels like a test he might fail in front of the entire city. But here's what Romans didn't advertise about their most sacred garment. The toga was absolutely impractical in every possible way. Roman men spent centuries complaining about these things. The 18-foot length meant you were constantly at risk of tripping over your own clothing. The thick wool made you overheat in Rome's Mediterranean climate. The complex draping meant you couldn't put the thing on by yourself. You needed help from slaves or family members every single morning. Wealthy Romans employed special servants whose only job was toga management. Think about that. Your clothing was so complicated, you needed professional help just to get dressed. The white color looked impressive and symbolized purity and new beginnings, but it also showed every single stain, smudge, and spot of dirt you encountered during the day. Romans had to send their togas out for professional cleaning constantly, which was expensive and time-consuming. Some men tried to avoid wearing their togas except for the most formal occasions, but this created its own problems. Show up underdressed to an important event, and you'd insult your hosts and damage your reputation. Young men from poor families faced an even harsher reality. A proper toga cost serious money, and many families simply couldn't afford one. Some boys from lower-class backgrounds never officially became adults because they lacked the resources for a proper ceremony. Imagine being trapped in legal childhood forever because your family was broke. These young men couldn't legally marry, conduct business, or participate in politics. They existed in a social gray area where they were clearly adults physically, but remained children in the eyes of Roman law. The timing of Marcus's ceremony isn't random either. March 17th coincides with the Liberalia festival, the traditional day for boys to assume the Toga virilis. The festival honors Liber, a god associated with freedom and coming of age. The symbolism is intentional and powerful. On the same day Romans celebrate liberation and adult independence, boys across the city shed their childhood identities and step into citizenship. The festival atmosphere makes the whole experience feel even more significant and public. Marcus's new toga grants him specific legal rights that mark his transition to full citizenship. He can now vote in elections, marry with his father's consent, and appear in court to conduct business or legal affairs. These aren't privileges Romans gave to teenagers lightly. By putting on the toga virilis, Marcus has officially declared he's ready to handle adult responsibilities that could affect his entire family's fortune and reputation. The psychological pressure is intense. Marcus knows that every decision he makes from now on reflects not just on himself but on his father, his grandfather, and generations of family members who carried their name before him. The toga isn't just clothing. It's a constant reminder that he represents something bigger than his individual desires and mistakes. Some young Romans cracked under this pressure. They'd make expensive mistakes, embarrass their families at public events, or freeze up when expected to speak or act like adults. The transition from protected childhood to full citizenship happened so suddenly that not everyone could handle it successfully. Failed young citizens became family embarrassments that people whispered about for years. Marcus adjusts his toga one final time as his family prepares to escort him to the forum. The heavy wool settles around his shoulders like the weight of Roman expectations. He's no longer the boy who fingered his protective Bulla yesterday morning. He's a citizen of Rome, with all the power and pressure that identity brings. But across the city, other Roman teenagers face a very different kind of transformation. One that happens without ceremony, without celebration, and often without warning. Livia's reality couldn't be more different. Her transition to adulthood wouldn't involve any ceremonies, public recognition, or family gatherings. Instead, she might simply wake up one morning to discover her father had promised her in marriage to a man she'd never met. No trumpets, no speeches, no ritual removal of childhood symbols. Just a quiet conversation where her mother would explain that her life as she knew it was over. Roman girls had absolutely no equivalent to the toga ceremony that transformed boys into citizens. While Marcus gained legal rights and social recognition through his public ritual, Livia's path to womanhood ran through marriage arrangements made entirely by her father. Think about how isolating this must have felt. Marcus got to stand in front of his extended family and receive their blessing as he became a man. Livia got a private talk about her upcoming betrothal, probably delivered by female relatives while the men discussed business in another room. The speed of this transformation would shock you. Roman law allowed girls to be betrothed between ages 12 and 14. That's 6th or 7th grade in modern terms. The actual wedding might follow within months or years, depending on family politics and how quickly the fathers could negotiate the dowry terms. But once that betrothal happened, childhood was officially over. No gradual transition, no time to adjust to the idea. One day you're playing with dolls, the next day you're learning how to manage a household and planning your wedding. Livia's education reflected this reality in ways that seem almost cruel by today's standards. While Marcus spent years studying rhetoric, philosophy, and military tactics to prepare for citizenship, Livia learned household management, weaving, and how to supervise slaves. Her tutors focused on practical skills like organizing dinner parties, managing household budgets, and maintaining the family's social reputation. She practiced spinning wool until her fingers were raw and memorized recipes for everything from bread to medicinal remedies. The contrast is stark when you really think about it. Marcus learned to debate in the forum and command soldiers in battle. Livia learned to count linens and discipline kitchen staff. Both sets of skills were considered essential for Roman society, but only one path led to public recognition and legal authority. Livia's expertise would be judged by how smoothly her household ran and how well she supported her husband's career, not by any achievements of her own. Some girls tried to fight back against these arrangements, though their options were extremely limited. A few attempted to delay their marriages by claiming religious duties or pretending to be seriously ill. Imagine being so desperate to avoid marriage that you'd fake a chronic disease or claim the gods had called you to temple service. But Roman fathers rarely accepted these excuses. Your father held absolute legal authority over your future, and very few things could override his decision to marry you off. Unlike boys who lost their protective bullas during the Toga ceremony, girls continued wearing their childhood amulets like the Bulla through marriage and beyond. The engagement ring became another symbol layered on top of these existing charms. Romans wore these rings on the fourth finger of the left hand, believing a vein ran directly from that finger to the heart. The ring itself was usually simple iron or gold, but its psychological impact was enormous. Every time Livia looked at her hand, she'd see this symbol of her impending transformation announcing to everyone that she was no longer available, no longer free to dream about her own future. Wealthy families like Livia's offered slightly more input than poorer girls received, but even this limited influence came through indirect channels. Livia might express preferences to her mother, who could then mention them to her father during private conversations. But these were suggestions, not demands. Her father might consider her feelings if they aligned with his political and financial goals, but he'd override them without hesitation if necessary. Most girls learned about their betrothals from their mothers or older female relatives who'd been tasked with breaking the news gently. The lack of ceremony made everything worse. Marcus's toga ritual gave him a clear moment when childhood ended and adulthood began. Everyone understood exactly what was happening and why it mattered. Livia's transformation happened in whispered conversations and quiet preparations. No one gathered to celebrate her growing up or acknowledge her new responsibilities. The absence of ritual didn't make her transition less significant. It just made it more lonely and confusing. This quiet approach reflected Roman attitudes about women's roles in society. Men's lives were public, so their transitions deserved public recognition. Women's lives were private, centered around family and household management. So, their transitions happened privately too. But this logic ignored the emotional reality of what these girls experienced. The lack of ceremony created a barrier that protected adults from fully acknowledging the magnitude of what they were imposing on their daughters. The timing often seemed random and cruel. While Marcus spent months preparing for his toga ceremony, knowing exactly when it would happen and what to expect, Livia might discover her betrothal on an ordinary Tuesday morning. Her father might return from the forum with news that he'd accepted a marriage proposal during a casual business conversation. No advance warning. No time to prepare emotionally for what was coming. The legal reality was stark and immediate. Upon betrothal, Livia would transfer from her father's patria potestas to her future husband's manus, shifting her legal guardianship without gaining any independent rights. This wasn't a gradual process or a negotiation. It was a complete transfer of authority over her person and any property she might inherit. Roman society treated this difference as natural and appropriate, but the contrast reveals how Roman culture valued male achievement and female compliance in ways that shaped every aspect of these teenagers' experiences. While Marcus stepped confidently into his new role as a citizen, Livia prepared to surrender her childhood knowing that her adult life would be defined entirely by the choices other people made for her. The months of a preparation ahead would culminate in a single ceremony that would legally transform her identity forever. The morning Livia has been dreading for months finally arrives. She wakes up in her childhood bedroom for the last time, knowing that by sunset she'll be sleeping in a stranger's house as his legal property. Today's ceremony won't celebrate her love or happiness. It's a business transaction that will transfer ownership of her from her father to her new husband, complete with dowry negotiations and property paperwork that treats her like valuable livestock being sold at market. You need to understand that Roman weddings had absolutely nothing to do with romance or personal choice. These ceremonies existed to create political alliances, combine family fortunes, and produce legitimate heirs who could inherit property and carry on family names. Love was considered a nice bonus if it happened to develop later, but it wasn't remotely necessary for a successful marriage. Livia's father and her future husband spent weeks negotiating the financial details of her transfer. How much money would change hands? Which properties would be included in her dowry? What would happen to these assets if she died in childbirth or if her husband divorced her for failing to produce sons? The pressure on this single day is absolutely crushing. If anything goes wrong during the ceremony, the entire marriage could be called off, leaving Livia in complete social limbo. Imagine having your entire future depend on everything going perfectly during one afternoon. Bad weather could be interpreted as divine disapproval. Family arguments could derail months of careful negotiations. Even something as simple as tripping over your wedding dress could be seen as a terrible omen that would make the groom's family reconsider the whole arrangement. Livia's wedding outfit tells you everything about Roman priorities. She wears a bright orange veil called a flammium that makes her look like she's on fire. The color is supposed to represent the flame of life and fertility, but it also makes her impossible to miss in a crowd. Everyone who sees her will know exactly what's happening and why it matters for both families involved. Her hair has been styled in a specific way, using a spear point, which sounds romantic until you realize the spear represents the warrior husbands she's expected to produce for Rome's army. The ceremony begins with a sacrifice that could destroy everything in seconds. A pig or sheep gets dragged to the altar while both families watch nervously. If the animal struggles too much, refuses to approach the altar, or produces bad-looking entrails when it's killed, the whole wedding could be cancelled on the spot. Romans took these omens seriously enough to call off major political alliances based on how a pig behaved during its final moments. Livia stands there in her orange veil, knowing that a nervous sheep could ruin her life. The wedding guests don't exactly help create a dignified atmosphere. Roman wedding celebrations included crude jokes, sexual comments, and fertility rituals that would make modern people extremely uncomfortable. Guests throw nuts at the bride for good luck, which sounds sweet until you realize they're also shouting explicit advice about her upcoming wedding night. Everyone expects Livia to look modest and submissive through all of this, smiling graciously while strangers make jokes about her body and her future sex life. The most famous part of the ceremony happens when Livia's new husband carries her over the threshold of his house. This isn't romantic either. Romans believed evil spirits could enter a home through a woman's feet if she walked across the threshold normally. By carrying her inside, her husband protects his household from supernatural contamination that might come with his new wife. The message is pretty clear. Women are spiritually dangerous and need to be managed carefully to prevent them from bringing bad luck to their new families. Once the public ceremony ends, Livia faces the reality of her new life. She gets taken to a house full of strangers who are now her legal family. The household slaves who used to take orders from her husband's mother now answer to her, but she has no idea how to manage them effectively. These servants have worked together for years and developed their own systems and relationships. Now, a teenage girl who's never run a household is supposed to take charge and make everything work smoothly. The family dynamics are often completely awkward from day one. Many Roman brides were significantly younger than their husbands, which created situations where Livia might be the same age as her new stepchildren, or even younger than some of them. Imagine trying to establish authority over people who remember when your husband was married to their mother. Some of these stepchildren resent their father's new young wife and make her life miserable through small acts of defiance and disrespect. Livia's legal status changes completely the moment she says her wedding vows. She's now officially a matrona, a married woman with real household responsibilities and social expectations. She's expected to manage servants, organize dinner parties, handle household budgets, and start producing children as quickly as possible. But here's the catch that shows how unfair Roman society really was. Even though she has all these new responsibilities, she still has extremely limited legal rights. She can't own property in her own name, can't make major decisions without her husband's permission, and can't even leave the house for extended periods without his approval. The contrast with Marcus's situation reveals the fundamental inequality built into Roman society. While Livia's wedding ceremony gives her immediate adult responsibilities and changes her legal status overnight, Marcus won't face the serious business of adult life for years. Roman men were generally barred from political candidacy until age 25 by the Lex Vilia Annalis. He got to celebrate his Toga ceremony and enjoy recognition as a citizen, but he'll spend nearly a decade in an extended apprenticeship called tirocinium. This period included Tirocinium Fori for legal training and Tirocinium Militia for military service. Ancient sources like Cicero's letters warned of various pitfalls that could trap new Togati during these vulnerable years. Livia gets thrown into the deep end of adult responsibility at 14, while Marcus gets nearly a decade to figure things out at his own pace. Roman wedding ceremonies were designed to be final and irreversible in ways that modern people would find terrifying. Once Livia walked through that ceremony, there was no going back to her childhood home except for visits that required her husband's permission. Her father no longer had any legal authority over her life. Her mother couldn't protect her from an abusive husband. She was completely dependent on the man she'd just married, who might be kind and respectful, or might treat her like property he'd purchased for breeding purposes. The ceremony marks the end of any dreams Livia might have had about controlling her own destiny. While Marcus gained legal recognition through his Toga ceremony, Livia's wedding represents the complete surrender of her independence. She's traded her father's control for her husband's control, with no period of personal freedom in between. Her childhood is over, her adult responsibilities have begun, and her future success will be measured entirely by how well she serves her new family's interests rather than pursuing any goals of her own. But Marcus's path to full adulthood would prove far more complicated than his Toga ceremony suggested. Marcus adjusts his new toga and feels like a real Roman citizen. But here's the shocking truth that nobody mentioned during his ceremony. He can't actually act like an adult until he turns 25. That's 9 more years of being treated like a kid in a man's costume. Roman law recognized that putting on adult clothing didn't magically create adult judgment. So they created this weird extended adolescence called tirocinium that lasted nearly a decade. Think about how frustrating this must have been for someone like Marcus. He went through all the ceremony and ritual of becoming a citizen, received congratulations from strangers in the street, and gained the legal right to marry and conduct business. But then Roman society basically said, "Actually, we don't trust you to make important decisions yet. So we're going to treat you like a teenager for another 9 years." The Tirocinium was supposed to be a learning period where young men figured out how to be adults without the full privileges or responsibilities that came with real citizenship. The dangers during these years were absolutely real and could destroy a young man's entire future. Marcus could be cheated in business deals by older, more experienced Romans who knew he lacked the wisdom to spot their tricks. Manipulative politicians could use his inexperience to their advantage, convincing him to support causes that would damage his family's reputation. Every mistake he made during this period would follow him for the rest of his life, affecting his marriage prospects, career opportunities, and social standing. Roman lawmakers understood this vulnerability and created the Lex Platoria specifically to protect young men under 25 from their own poor judgment. This law prevented them from entering into major business contracts or financial agreements that could bankrupt their families. But here's the catch that made everything more complicated. The same law that protected Marcus from making costly mistakes also prevented him from holding political office or participating in the serious business of Roman government. He was stuck in this legal gray area where he had some adult rights but not others. The Tirocinium actually included 2 different types of training that prepared young men for their eventual adult roles. Marcus would spend part of his time in Tirocinium Fori, which meant following an older mentor around the forum and law courts to learn about politics and legal procedures. Imagine being a teenager whose job is basically to shadow a successful adult all day, watching how they handle negotiations, court cases, and political discussions. You'd learn a lot, but you'd also feel like a glorified intern who couldn't participate in any of the important conversations happening around you. The other part of Marcus's training involved Tyrocinium militia, military apprenticeship that could include real combat on Rome's dangerous frontiers. This wasn't practice fighting with wooden swords in a safe training ground. Young Romans during their Tyrocinium period could find themselves facing Germanic tribes, Egyptian rebels, or Gallic warriors in actual battles where people died horrible deaths. The military training was supposed to build character and courage, but it also meant Marcus could be killed or permanently injured before he even reached full adulthood. Some young men couldn't handle this extended period of limited responsibility and tried to prove their maturity through increasingly reckless behavior. They'd spend massive amounts of money on expensive clothing, elaborate dinner parties, or risky business ventures to show everyone they were ready for adult privileges. Others would pick fights with older men, challenge authority figures, or engage in dangerous activities that put themselves and their families at risk. The pressure to prove you were mature enough for real adulthood led many young Romans to make exactly the kind of poor decisions the Tyrocinium was designed to prevent. The mentor relationship during this period was absolutely crucial and could make or break a young man's entire future. A good mentor would introduce Marcus to important people, teach him valuable skills, and help him avoid the mistakes that destroyed other young men's careers. But a bad mentor could ruin everything. Imagine being paired with someone who had terrible judgment, enemies throughout Roman society, or a reputation for corruption. Everything your mentor did would reflect on you, and his failures would become your failures in the eyes of everyone who mattered. Marcus's mentor would essentially control his access to Roman high society during these formative years. If his mentor was well connected and respected, Marcus would meet senators, successful merchants, and military commanders who could help his career later. But if his mentor was mediocre or disliked, Marcus would spend years learning from someone who couldn't teach him much, and wouldn't introduce him to anyone important. The social connections you made during Tyrocinium often determined your success for the rest of your life. The psychological pressure of this extended apprenticeship was intense in ways that modern teenagers probably can't imagine. Marcus had to balance showing appropriate respect for his elders, while also demonstrating that he was developing the judgment and skills necessary for adult leadership. Too much deference made him look weak and unprepared. Too much independence made him look arrogant and disrespectful. Finding the right balance required constant attention to social cues and political dynamics that could change without warning. The contrast with Livia's situation reveals just how different Roman society's expectations were for boys and girls. While Marcus got 9 years to gradually learn adult responsibilities and make mistakes in a relatively protected environment, Livia was thrown immediately into the deep end of adult life, with no preparation period or safety net. She went from childhood to managing a household, supervising slaves, and bearing children with no extended apprenticeship to help her figure things out. The Tyrocinium period also meant that Marcus would spend his late teens and early 20s watching other people make decisions about Rome's future while he stood on the sidelines taking notes. He could observe Senate debates but couldn't participate. He could watch court cases but couldn't argue them. He could accompany military expeditions but couldn't command troops. The frustration of being old enough to understand what was happening but too young to influence it must have been overwhelming for ambitious young men. Both Marcus and Livia would need more than legal frameworks and social expectations to navigate these treacherous years successfully. They'd need divine guidance and supernatural protection to survive the challenges ahead, and they found it in the most unexpected places. Roman teenagers found this guidance in their dreams, where Venus delivered messages tailored specifically to their age and circumstances. Both Marcus and Livia knelt before the same household shrine each night, whispering prayers to Venus for guidance through their confusing teenage years. But here's what would blow your mind about Roman religion. Venus didn't send the same dreams to everyone who prayed to her. The goddess of love crafted completely different messages depending on whether you were a 14-year-old girl or a 16-year-old boy. Romans believed dreams were direct communication from the gods, and Venus specialized in helping young people navigate the treacherous waters of love, marriage, and growing up. The stakes for getting these dream interpretations right were absolutely terrifying. Misread what Venus was trying to tell you, and you might end up in a disastrous marriage that would ruin your family's reputation for generations. Choose the wrong romantic partner based on a dream you interpreted incorrectly, and you could find yourself divorced, disgraced, or worse. Roman teenagers lived in constant fear that they'd miss some crucial, divine message that could change their entire lives. Every strange dream felt like a test they might fail with catastrophic consequences. When Livia dreamed of Venus offering her a golden apple, professional dream interpreters would tell her family this meant a wealthy marriage was coming soon. The golden apple represented prosperity, fertility, and divine approval of her upcoming betrothal. Imagine being 14 and having adults analyze your dreams to predict who you'd spend the rest of your life with. These weren't casual interpretations either. Families would pay serious money to have experts decode what the gods were trying to communicate through their daughters' sleeping minds. But here's where Roman dream interpretation gets really sophisticated and weird. If a married woman had that exact same dream about Venus and the golden apple, it meant something completely different and much more threatening. Dream interpreters would tell her this was a warning that her husband was having an affair, or that she needed to make immediate offerings to Venus to save her marriage. The same symbol carried opposite meanings depending on whether you were single or married. Your life stage determined what the gods were trying to tell you. Marcus experienced an entirely different version of Venus in his dreams. When he dreamed of the goddess wearing armor and carrying weapons, dream interpreters told him this meant success in both love and war. Venus in armor represented the perfect combination of romantic conquest and military victory that every young Roman man hoped to achieve. But if Marcus's father had the same dream, interpreters would warn that family conflicts were coming or that his marriage was in trouble. Age and social position changed everything about what the gods meant when they spoke to you. Professional dream interpreters charged absolutely massive fees for their services, and wealthy Roman families treated these consultations like essential business expenses. These specialists were called onero critici, and they had to memorize hundreds of different symbol combinations and meanings. Think about making your living by telling people what their dreams meant. You'd need to understand not just mythology and religious symbolism, but also psychology, family dynamics, and social politics. One wrong interpretation could destroy a client's life and ruin your own reputation. The most famous surviving dream interpretation manual from antiquity is Artemidorus's Onirocritica, which shows just how complex and detailed this practice became. Rich families consulted dream interpreters before making any major decisions about their teenagers' futures. Should Marcus get engaged this year or wait until he's older? Was Livia's dream about white doves a sign that her betrothal would be happy? These weren't casual questions. Roman parents spent fortunes trying to decode their children's dreams because they genuinely believed the gods were providing specific guidance about important life choices. Some Roman teenagers became fascinated with their dreams and would record memorable ones in personal letters or dedicatory inscriptions. They'd compare interpretations with their friends to see if anyone else had received similar messages from the gods. Imagine spending your teenage years analyzing every weird dream you had, convinced that missing some divine message could ruin your future. These kids would meet up and trade dream stories like modern teenagers sharing social media posts. The social aspect of dream interpretation created its own problems and pressures. If your friend dreamed about Venus blessing her with roses, but you kept having nightmares about the goddess frowning at you, what did that mean about your comparative worth? Roman teenagers would compete over who received the most positive divine messages, and parents would worry if their children seemed to be getting less favorable dreams than their peers' children. Venus's dream communication system was incredibly personalized in ways that modern people would find hard to believe. The goddess supposedly knew exactly where you were in your life journey, and sent appropriate messages for your specific situation. A girl approaching her first betrothal would receive different guidance than a young woman already married for several years. A boy preparing for his Toga ceremony would get different advice than a young man finishing his military training. This personalized approach made dream interpretation feel like having a divine life coach who understood your individual circumstances and challenges. Venus wasn't just sending generic advice to everyone who prayed to her. She was crafting specific guidance based on your age, social status, family situation, and current problems. The sophistication of this system impressed Romans so much that even skeptical intellectuals took dream interpretation seriously. The psychological pressure of waiting for divine guidance through dreams was intense for teenagers who already felt anxious about their futures. Marcus might lie awake wondering why Venus hadn't sent him any clear messages lately, worrying that the goddess had abandoned him or that he'd somehow offended her. Livia might have the same dream several nights in a row and panic about whether she was interpreting it correctly or missing some crucial detail. The Roman belief that Venus sent personalized dream messages to teenagers reveals how seriously they took the transition from childhood to adulthood. These weren't just random nighttime fantasies that people forgot by morning. Dreams were considered essential survival information that could help young people navigate the dangerous social and romantic landscape of Roman society. But Venus's sophisticated dream guidance system was only part of the supernatural support network that helped Roman teenagers survive their daily challenges. Beyond these nighttime revelations, Roman teenagers surrounded themselves with protective charms and daily superstitions designed to help them navigate the dangerous social landscape of their world. Marcus and Livia lived in a society where invisible forces supposedly controlled everything from academic success to romantic outcomes, and they used specific rituals to tip the odds in their favor. Picture Marcus getting ready for his biggest exam of the year, the one that would determine whether his tutor recommended him for advanced studies. He's not just reviewing his notes and practicing his speeches. He's sliding a special ring onto his finger, one engraved with Mercury's symbol of the caduceus. Roman students genuinely believed that Mercury, the messenger god who controlled communication and memory, would help them remember their lessons and speak more eloquently during oral exams. This wasn't casual superstition either. Wealthy families spent serious money on these Mercury rings, treating them like essential educational equipment. The psychological pressure made these charms feel absolutely necessary. Roman education was intensely competitive, with students from prestigious families fighting for limited spots in advanced rhetoric schools. Your performance on a single exam could determine whether you'd become a successful lawyer or spend your life managing your family's farm business. When the stakes were that high, wearing a god's symbol seemed like basic common sense rather than silly superstition. Meanwhile, Livia faced her own supernatural preparations as her betrothal approached. She'd carefully place fresh myrtle leaves under her pillow each night, hoping to dream about her future husband's face or personality. Myrtle was sacred to Venus, and Roman girls believed the goddess would use these leaves to send prophetic dreams about their romantic futures. Imagine being 14 and trying to catch glimpses of the stranger you'd spend your entire adult life with through magic-induced dreams. The myrtle ritual reveals how desperate these girls were for any information about their futures. They had no say in choosing their husbands, no chance to meet potential partners before engagement, and no way to back out if they didn't like what their parents had arranged. Sleeping with Venus's sacred plant under their heads felt like the only way to gain some insight into what awaited them. Both Marcus and Livia followed strict rules about personal grooming that modern teenagers would find completely bizarre. They avoided cutting their nails on certain days of the month, believing that trimming them at the wrong time would bring bad luck to their entire families. This wasn't just personal vanity or hygiene. Romans thought individual actions could affect their relatives' health, business success, and social standing. Roman teenagers also practiced protective rituals that seem harsh by today's standards, but made perfect sense within their belief system. When Marcus or Livia encountered someone with a physical disability, they'd immediately spit 3 times to ward off the evil eye. This wasn't cruelty or mockery. Romans genuinely believed that seeing certain types of misfortune could attract similar bad luck to yourself, unless you performed specific protective actions. The spitting ritual was supposed to break the supernatural connection between the observer and the observed misfortune. The evil eye belief was so widespread that Romans developed defense systems against it. Teenagers would carry small leather pouches filled with protective items like salt and iron nails. Salt was considered purifying and could neutralize jealousy from friends and rivals. Iron nails were supposed to pierce through supernatural attacks before they could affect the person carrying them. Think about how this affected daily social interactions. Roman teenagers had to worry not just about regular social drama, but also about supernatural attacks from jealous classmates. If someone complimented your new toga too enthusiastically, were they genuinely happy for you or trying to curse you with the evil eye? If a rival student performed better than you on an exam, should you be carrying extra protective charms to guard against their envy? The competitive atmosphere of Roman society made these supernatural concerns feel completely rational. Wealthy families fought constantly over political positions, business contracts, and marriage alliances that could affect their status for generations. In that environment, using magical protection against rivals' jealousy seemed like basic self-defense rather than paranoid superstition. These daily rituals served an important psychological function that modern people might not appreciate. Roman teenagers lived in a society where their futures were largely determined by forces beyond their control. Their parents chose their marriage partners. Their social class determined their career options. Their family's political connections affected their opportunities for advancement. In that environment, having small magical practices that felt like personal agency probably helped them cope with feelings of powerlessness. The supernatural protection systems also created a sense of community among Roman teenagers who shared similar anxieties and beliefs. Friends would compare protective charms, trade lucky stones, and warn each other about unlucky days for important activities. These shared superstitions gave them a common language for discussing their fears and hopes about the future. Roman families even observed specific timing restrictions for major life events. Many avoided scheduling weddings during the month of May, believing marriages conducted then would be cursed or unhappy. This superstition was so strong that wealthy families would delay important betrothal ceremonies rather than risk supernatural disapproval. But here's the reality that makes all these protective measures even more significant. Despite their best supernatural efforts, some Roman teenagers still failed to meet their families' expectations. The charms didn't always work. The rituals couldn't prevent every disaster, and when young Romans brought shame to their households, the consequences could destroy entire family legacies for generations. Marcus might have supernatural protection and family support, but not every Roman boy successfully navigated his transition to manhood. When they failed, the consequences were absolutely devastating for everyone involved. Picture a 16-year-old who freezes up during his Toga ceremony, stumbling over the ritual words or tripping in his new white robes in front of his entire extended family. Or imagine a young man who runs away from his first real battle, abandoning his fellow soldiers when they needed him most. These weren't just personal embarrassments that people forgot about after a few weeks. These failures could destroy entire family legacies and ruin the social standing that previous generations had spent decades building. The social exile that followed these failures extended far beyond just the boy who messed up. Roman society operated on family honor, which meant that when a son disgraced himself, his father's business relationship suffered. His sisters might find their marriage prospects damaged because potential husbands worried about connecting their families to people associated with shame and cowardice. His younger brothers would grow up knowing that people whispered about their family's failed son whenever they walked through the forum. The ripple effects of one teenager's failure could affect dozens of relatives for years or even decades. Some Roman families decided they'd rather completely disown a failed son than live with the ongoing shame his presence brought to their household. This wasn't just angry parents threatening to kick their kid out of the house. Under Roman family law, the paterfamilias held the right of expositio, the legal authority to abandon children who brought dishonor to the household. This formal process officially removed the boy's name from family records and forbade any relatives from providing him with help, money, or even basic social recognition. Imagine waking up one day to discover that your parents had legally erased you from existence, leaving you with no identity, no support system, and no way back into the society you'd grown up in. Boys who couldn't handle wearing the toga properly faced a special kind of social mockery that followed them everywhere they went. Romans took their clothing seriously, and a man who couldn't drape his toga correctly was seen as fundamentally unfit for citizenship. These fashion failures weren't just embarrassing, they were seen as proof that the boy lacked the basic competence and cultural knowledge necessary to be a real Roman. Other citizens would mock them as effeminate and exclude them from important social gatherings where real business got conducted. Think about how devastating this must have been for a teenager who'd spent his entire childhood preparing for adult citizenship. You'd gone through the Bulla ceremony, received your new toga, and officially become a man in the eyes of Roman law. But then you'd discover that nobody took your citizenship seriously because you looked ridiculous every time you tried to dress yourself. The toga was so complicated that some failed young men never figured out how to wear it properly, condemning them to permanent second-class status among their peers. Military cowardice represented the absolute worst kind of failure a Roman boy could experience. Young men who ran from battle or showed fear in front of enemy forces faced punishments designed to strip them of their masculinity and mark them as permanently unfit for Roman society. According to Vegesius, the most humiliating punishment involved forcing cowards to wear women's clothing in public, a practice that announced to everyone who saw them that they'd abandoned their duties as men and soldiers. This wasn't a temporary embarrassment either. Some cowards were required to dress as women for months or even years as ongoing punishment for their failures. The logic behind this punishment reveals how seriously Romans took gender roles and military service. By forcing failed soldiers to wear dresses and women's makeup, Roman authorities were essentially saying that cowardice transformed men into women and that this transformation was so shameful it needed to be displayed publicly as a warning to others. The psychological impact of this humiliation was probably worse than physical punishment, since it attacks the core of these young men's identity and self-worth. Failed sons often found themselves forced into occupations that Romans considered shameful and degrading. Acting and gladiator training were common destinations for boys who disgraced their families, since these professions were associated with low social status and moral corruption. Actors were seen as little better than prostitutes, since they pretended to be other people for money and entertainment. Gladiators were essentially slaves who fought for the amusement of others, regardless of whether they'd originally been born free. Being pushed into these careers meant accepting that you'd never be treated as a respectable citizen again. Some families would send their failed sons to distant provinces, where their shame wouldn't be constantly visible to friends and business associates. These boys might end up managing remote farms, working in frontier outposts, or handling other jobs that kept them far away from Rome's social centers. While this exile was less harsh than complete disownment, it still meant losing any chance of participating in the political and cultural life that defined Roman identity. You'd spend your adult years knowing that your family considered you too embarrassing to live near them. The most desperate failed sons sometimes abandoned Roman society completely and joined mystery cults or became bandits operating outside the law. Mystery religions offered alternative communities for people who couldn't find acceptance in mainstream Roman culture. Though joining them meant giving up any hope of returning to respectable society later. Becoming a bandit was even more extreme. It meant accepting that you were now an enemy of the same civilization you'd grown up in, living by robbery and violence in the wilderness beyond Roman control. The intense pressure to avoid these terrible fates created serious mental health problems for Roman boys approaching their transition ceremonies. some developed what we'd now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, becoming so terrified of potential failure that they couldn't function normally in social situations. Others fell into depression, feeling overwhelmed by expectations they weren't sure they could meet. The weight of knowing that one mistake could destroy not just your own future, but your entire family's reputation was probably unbearable for many teenagers. Roman society created these harsh consequences because they believed that fear of failure would motivate boys to try harder and achieve better results. But the system probably created as many problems as it solved, turning the natural challenges of growing up into life or death struggles that some teenagers simply couldn't handle successfully. At least these boys had opportunities for redemption through military service or later achievements. For Roman girls, failure carried even more devastating consequences, with far fewer chances for recovery. Livia's situation reveals the brutal reality that Roman girls faced when they couldn't secure marriages. For Roman women, being deemed unsuitable for marriage was essentially a death sentence for your social existence. Marriage wasn't just one option among many for girls like Livia. It was literally the only path to adult status, legal recognition, and any kind of meaningful life in Roman society. Fail to marry, and you'd spend your entire existence as a legal non-person, dependent on relatives who increasingly saw you as an expensive burden they couldn't get rid of. The ways a Roman girl could become unmarriageable would shock you with their cruel specificity. Physical imperfections topped the list of disqualifying factors. A visible scar from childhood illness could destroy your marriage prospects completely. Chronic health problems that might affect your ability to bear children would make potential husbands run in the opposite direction. Even something as simple as a limp or missing teeth could transform you from a desirable bride into damaged goods that no respectable family would want to acquire through marriage. The psychological impact on families with physically imperfect daughters was devastating. Rather than hiding these girls away, as some might imagine, families often delayed marriages due to inadequate dowries or political considerations, as documented in Augustan legislation like the Lex Papia Popia. Parents would make excuses for why certain daughters hadn't yet been betrothed, hoping that time might improve their circumstances or that they could eventually scrape together better marriage settlements. Family financial disasters created another pathway to unmarriageability that could destroy a girl's future overnight. Roman marriages required substantial dowries that fathers had to provide to make their daughters attractive to potential husbands. A business failure, bad investment, or political scandal could wipe out a family's wealth and leave their daughters without adequate dowries. No dowry meant no marriage offers, regardless of how beautiful or well-behaved the girl might be. The dowry system was so central to Roman marriage that families would go into crushing debt to provide adequate marriage settlements for their daughters. Some fathers borrowed money at ruinous interest rates rather than see their girls remain unmarried. Others would sell family property, dismiss household slaves, or make other desperate sacrifices to scrape together enough wealth to make their daughters marriageable. The alternative was watching their girls become permanent dependents with no hope of adult independence or social recognition. Unmarriageable girls had few alternative paths available to them, and most of these options required family connections or wealth that many couldn't access. Becoming a priestess offered some social standing and purpose, but these religious positions were extremely limited and often went to girls from the most powerful families. You couldn't just decide to become a priestess because marriage wasn't working out. You needed political influence, family connections to important religious figures, and usually a substantial donation to the temple to secure one of these coveted spots. The priestess option also came with its own set of restrictions and sacrifices. Many religious positions required vows of chastity that made marriage impossible forever. You'd gain social respect and spiritual authority, but you'd give up any chance of having children, managing your own household, or experiencing the kind of adult relationship that defined most women's lives. Some girls chose this path willingly, but others were pushed into religious service by families who saw it as the only way to avoid the shame of having an unmarried daughter. The most desperate families would sometimes arrange marriages between their unmarriageable daughters and men who had their own serious problem. Much older widowers looking for young wives to care for them in their final years. Men with reputations for violence, drinking, or financial irresponsibility. Widowers with difficult children from previous marriages who needed someone to manage their households. These weren't marriages anyone would choose freely. They were business arrangements designed to solve problems for both families involved. Think about what this meant for girls who found themselves in these marriages of last resort. You'd spend your adult life caring for an elderly man who might die within a few years, leaving you a young widow with limited prospects for remarriage. Or you'd be stuck with an abusive husband whose character flaws had made him unmarriageable to more desirable women. These arrangements gave girls the technical status of married women, but often at the cost of their happiness, safety, and any chance of a fulfilling relationship. The legal reality for unmarried Roman women was harsh in ways that modern people struggle to understand. These women had no legal standing in court. They couldn't inherit property in their own names. They couldn't make business decisions or enter into contracts. They couldn't even leave their family homes for extended periods without male permission. Unmarried women remained legal children their entire lives, dependent on fathers, brothers, or other male relatives who might die and leave them with no protection or support. Unlike boys who could redeem themselves through later military service, business success, or political achievements, girls who failed to marry had almost no options for changing their fate. Roman society offered men multiple chances to prove themselves worthy of respect and citizenship. Women got one chance through marriage, and if that didn't work out, they were essentially finished as social beings. These harsh realities created enormous pressure on families to ensure their daughters' marriageability at any cost. The consequences of failure were so severe that parents would make almost any sacrifice to avoid having an unmarried daughter become a permanent burden on the family. But here's what made everything even more complicated. Not all Roman families faced these challenges with the same resources or advantages. Marcus, son of a wealthy senator, stands next to Gaius, whose father works a small farm outside Rome. Both boys are 16, both wear the white toga virilis for the first time. But everything else about their experiences of becoming Roman men exists in completely different universes. Marcus's toga is woven from the finest wool money can buy, professionally fitted by skilled tailors who spent days getting every fold perfect. Gaius's toga is rough homespun cloth that his mother stitched together herself, and it hangs awkwardly because no one in his family really knows how these things are supposed to look. The ceremonies themselves tell you everything about how class shaped these transitions. Marcus's family hired professional musicians, brought in expensive sacrificial animals, and invited dozens of important guests who could help his future career. The whole event cost more money than Gaius's family sees in multiple years. Meanwhile, Gaius's ceremony happened in his family's cramped farmhouse with a single chicken as the sacrifice and maybe 3 relatives who could take time off from working the fields to attend. Some poor families couldn't afford proper ceremonies at all, leaving their sons stuck in this weird legal gray area where they weren't children anymore but couldn't prove they'd officially become adults either. Education created the biggest divide between rich and poor Roman teenagers. Marcus spent years studying with private tutors who taught him rhetoric, philosophy, Greek literature, and political theory. He learned how to give speeches that could sway Senate debates and how to write legal arguments that might determine the fate of entire provinces. His education prepared him to become a lawyer, politician, or military commander who could shape Rome's future. Gaius learned how to plow fields, repair farm tools, and maybe read well enough to keep basic records. His father taught him practical skills that would help him survive, but nothing that would let him rise above his current social position. The military service that both boys faced revealed another layer of class differences. Marcus would become an officer, commanding troops and making strategic decisions that could win or lose battles. His wealthy background meant people automatically assumed he had leadership abilities and gave him respect from day one. Gaius would be a common soldier, following orders and probably dying in some frontier skirmish that nobody in Rome would ever hear about. The same military service that could make Marcus a war hero would likely just get Gaius killed, without anyone caring about his sacrifice. For girls, the class divide was even more brutal and obvious. Rich girls like Livia married into powerful families with elaborate dowries that included money, property, slaves, and valuable household goods. Their weddings were major social events that strengthened political alliances and business relationships between important families. Poor girls got sold into marriages that were basically slavery with extra steps. Their dowries might be a single cow or a few pieces of cheap jewelry. Nobody celebrated these weddings because they weren't really celebrations. They were desperate families getting rid of daughters they couldn't afford to keep. Girls from wealthy families received formal domestic education that prepared them to manage large households and supervise dozens of slaves. They studied music, literature, and the complex social protocols required for entertaining important guests. Poor girls learned informal household skills from their mothers and female relatives, basic cooking, cleaning, and simple weaving that would help them survive in much humbler circumstances. Both sets of skills were called domestic training, but they prepared these girls for adult lives that had almost nothing in common except the legal requirement to obey their husbands. The supernatural support systems that helped teenagers navigate these dangerous years also depended entirely on your family's wealth. Rich families like Marcus's could afford to consult professional dream interpreters who charged enormous fees for analyzing what the gods were trying to communicate through their children's sleeping minds. They bought expensive protective amulets made from rare materials and blessed by famous priests. Poor families relied on folk wisdom passed down through generations and homemade charms crafted from whatever cheap materials they could find. Think about how this affected these teenagers' confidence and sense of divine protection. Marcus wore a gold amulet that cost more than most people's annual income, blessed by priests who claimed direct connections to powerful gods. He felt like the gods were personally invested in his success and would intervene to help him succeed. Gaius carried a leather pouch filled with common stones and bits of iron that his grandmother had blessed with half-remembered prayers. Both boys believed in supernatural protection, but only one of them felt like he had premium coverage from the divine insurance company. The children of slaves faced a reality so harsh it's hard to even imagine. They had no coming-of-age ceremonies at all. No toga ceremony, no protective charms, no divine guidance. They remained property regardless of how old they got, with no legal rights or social recognition until they could somehow buy their freedom or have it granted by their owners. A slave child could be 40 years old and still be treated exactly the same as a 5-year-old slave. Age meant nothing when you were considered a piece of equipment, rather than a human being with a future. Some poor families bankrupted themselves trying to provide proper ceremonies for their children because they genuinely believed these rituals were essential for future success. They'd borrow money at crushing interest rates, sell family land, or make other desperate sacrifices to give their sons decent togas and proper coming-of-age celebrations. These families understood that without the right ceremony, their children would be permanently marked as inferior and excluded from opportunities that required proof of proper adult status. The visual markers of class were impossible to hide and followed these teenagers everywhere they went. The quality of your clothing immediately announced your social position to everyone who saw you. Marcus's perfectly draped toga marked him as someone worth knowing and respecting. Gaius's rough, poorly fitted version told everyone he met that he came from people who didn't matter. Even where you lived announced your status to the world. Augustus had set limits on the height of apartment blocks, but lower-class housing in the insulae remained overcrowded and dangerous, while wealthy families owned spacious homes with private courtyards and gardens. These class differences created parallel worlds where Roman teenagers shared the same city but lived completely different realities. They worshipped the same gods but received different levels of divine protection. They participated in similar ceremonies but with vastly different resources and social recognition. Your family's wealth determined not just your opportunities, but your basic human dignity and chance of survival. Yet despite these harsh inequalities, Roman society created something that modern cultures have largely abandoned: a clear system for helping young people navigate the terrifying transition from childhood to adult responsibility. What archaeology and ancient texts reveal about these Roman teenagers shows us two completely different but equally structured pathways through adolescence. Boys like Marcus experienced public ceremonies and protected transitions, Bulla sacrifices and toga wearing followed by years of guided apprenticeship before full citizenship. Girls like Livia faced private marriages and lifelong household roles, moving directly from childhood into adult responsibilities through dowry negotiations and maternal protections. The research illuminates how both tracks relied on the same essential elements: myth, ritual, and superstition as social glue during the most dangerous years of growing up. Whether you were removing protective amulets in front of cheering relatives or whispering prayers to Venus about your future husband, Roman society understood that teenagers needed supernatural support and clear expectations to survive their transformation into adult. What part of Marcus and Livia's journey surprised you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, please like this video and subscribe to Mythical Midnight so you don't miss our next exploration. We have many more stories to tell.